Greetings, folks, and welcome to the wonderful world of the Bronte sisters. In this first little talk, what I'd like to do is pretty straightforward. Say a bit about the Brontes' lives themselves, just to get us set up for the three novels we're about to read, and then say a little bit about the major movements that we'll be addressing over Act 1 of the course, so over the next 6 weeks, and then conclude with a few slightly more detailed remarks on the Gothic, the first movement that I'd like to address. I hope you find it interesting. As for the Brontes themselves, their lives looked something like this. Charlotte was born in 1816, third daughter to the Reverend Patrick Bronte and his wife Maria. In 1817, her brother Patrick Branwell came along, and in 1818 and 1820 respectively, Emily and Anne completed the family. The Bronte family moved to Haworth in Yorkshire in 1820, and the following year, Maria Bronte died. The cause of her death is uncertain. I've read both tuberculosis and cancer as likely causes. In 1824, the four eldest Bronte sisters, that is all of the girls except for Anne, were enrolled in the clergy daughters' school at Cowan Bridge. This was a miserable place, and quite literally a lethal place. They suffered abuse and neglect, and if you want to get a picture of what their living conditions were like, this is the basis of the Lowood Institution in Jane Eyre. Speaking of which, in 1825, the two eldest Bronte sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, both died of tuberculosis while at school. Their deaths form much of the background of the death of Helen Burns, also in Jane Eyre. After their eldest sisters' deaths, Charlotte and Emily were of course brought home and educated by their father, who more or less let them read freely. They could read whatever they wanted, which I think is a great idea. My own daughter has unrestricted access to my bookcase. And he treated them as intellectual equals. He didn't condescend. This also strikes me as good parenting, but also because I never use baby talk with my own daughter. I simply speak to her as someone who I expect to understand me. But the result of their drawing close to each other because of the multiple family deaths that they'd experienced, and their father's approach to their education, which was very literate and literary, the surviving Bronte children grew up in profound isolation from the other people, the other children in their village, particularly intellectual isolation. They were better read, more cultured, had broader intellectual horizons. As a result of their isolation and of their educations, the four Brontes began creating their own worlds and writing stories about them. Charlotte and Branwell developed the imaginary world of Angria, a dream world, fantasy-like, fairy tale-like place, while Emily and Anne developed the more rugged land of Gondal, based on the moors and uplands of Yorkshire. It seems to have been both their isolation and their imaginative engagement both with themselves and with each other that pushed all of them, or drew rather all of them, toward literary production. In 1831, Charlotte attends the Roe Head School for about a year, but in 1832 she came back home to teach her sisters, returning in 1835 as a governess, during which time Emily also attended, but either became homesick or suffered a breakdown, depending on the source you read, and returned home within the year, her place being taken by Anne from 1836 to 1837. In 1838, Charlotte left Roe Head, and the following year did a 3-month stint as a governess for the Sidgwick family, following this up in 1841 with a 9-month stint with the White family. These experiences, of course, inform much of the narrative in Jane Eyre during the time that Jane is working as a governess herself. In any case, after both of these experiences, she, of course, returned home and spent time among her family. In 1841, the three sisters, under Charlotte's initiative, decided that they wanted to open their own school after they completed their own studies. And with this end in mind, in 1842, Charlotte and Emily went to Brussels in Belgium to finish their education, specifically to study language. The two came home for a visit after about a year, and Emily remained, but Charlotte returned to Brussels, where she stayed until 1844, when her studies were complete. By 1844, the sisters were ready to open their school, but it completely flopped financially. The following year, though, things started looking up. Charlotte discovered some of Emily's poems, which she hadn't shown her previously, and decided that the three sisters should publish jointly under the pseudonyms Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell, putting out a collection of their poems. The initials, of course, of these men's names correspond to the initials of the respective Bronte sisters, Kerr being Charlotte, Ellis, Emily, and Acton Anne. The fact that they felt obliged to publish under masculine pseudonyms in order to be taken seriously, which was not unheard of course, in the Victorian period. I'm thinking right now of Mary Ann Evans, aka George Eliot, is something that I certainly want to address as we discuss the novels, because feminism, first wave feminism, is one of the movements that's sort of on the agenda. In any case, in 1846, Charlotte completed her first novel, The Professor, but unfortunately it was rejected for publication at that time. The next few years, however, were both eventful and tragic. In 1847, Charlotte's Jane Eyre, Emily's Wuthering Heights, and Anne's Agnes Grey all saw their initial publications, and all were published under the Bell pseudonyms. In 1848, though, Charlotte and Anne went to London to visit their publisher and revealed the true identities of the Bells. Branwell, unfortunately, by this point an alcoholic and drug addict, addicted specifically to laudanum, an infusion of alcohol and opium, dies in 1848, and shortly thereafter Emily also dies, also of tuberculosis, with Anne following her the next year, also probably of tuberculosis, but not before managing to publish her second and final novel, Tenant of Wildfell Hall, much of whose action actually draws on the demise of her brother Branwell, and remains to this day one of the hardest-hitting novels of the Victorian period. It was also published initially under the name Acton Bell. So let's pause on this one for a second. Tuberculosis has killed, in this family alone, four of the five Bronte sisters, and quite possibly their mother as well. TB was, of course, one of the lurking diseases of the Victorian period. So ubiquitous, actually, that as soon as in a novel, for example, Jane Eyre, when you see a character who coughs, has flushed cheeks, and a bit of a sparkle to their eyes, all of which are physical symptoms of TB, any one of those is a strong hint that the person is suffering from what was at the time called consumption. And as we'll see in Jane Eyre, the disease flourishes particularly in damp, warm, heavy environments. And it was, as I said, one of the great lurking threats of the time period. The following year, Charlotte, now the last surviving Bronte, moved to London and began moving in literary circles, meeting other major writers of the time, for example, Thackeray and Gaskell. In 1850, she began editing her sister's works, and oddly wouldn't allow Tenant of Wildfell Hall to be reprinted until, I believe, 1854. In any case, in 1852, the curate at Haworth, Reverend A.B. Nichols, proposes marriage to Charlotte, to which her father was violently opposed, and to which Charlotte was not particularly inclined either, not being in love with him. So she refused his proposition, and he left. In 1853, Charlotte published Villette, the last of her novels to be published during her lifetime, and the following year did a bit of an about-face regarding Nichols and ended up getting married to him, her father's objections having cooled somewhat, but she never really having been in love with him, though she did seem to genuinely admire him. That year, while pregnant, Charlotte died of pneumonia, and it's speculated that she refused treatment. That is, that she chose to die. She was not a happy person. And when you consider how close she was to her siblings and that she was the last one standing at still a very early age, it's not surprising how unhappy she turned out to be. In any case, by 1854, one of the greatest literary families in the history of English literature, at the very least, had died, all of them young, most of them by pulmonary disease of one kind or another, leaving no children. I'm not aware of Branwell having fathered any, but a handful of really, really wonderful books. In 1857, Charlotte's first completed novel, The Professor, finally found its way into print. And in that same year, Gaskell published her biography, The Life of Charlotte Bronte. And this brings us to the end of the very short sketch of the tragically short lives of the Bronte sisters. So it's time to move on now to the next broad topic of this little chat. So, as for the specific movements that I'd like to address in Act 1 of our course, the unit on the Bronte sisters, there are basically 5. I'd like to look at Gothicism, Romanticism, Colonialism, Feminism, and the Temperance movement. Those last 2 are particularly prominent in Tenant of Wildfell Hall, while colonialism is really most obvious in Jane Eyre, but also really very present in Wuthering Heights. I'll be talking about colonialism sometime next week. All 3 of our novels, though, have deep roots in both the Gothic and the Romantic, which themselves actually have at least some significant common ground. So what I think I'd like to do with the rest of today's little talk is say a little bit about the Gothic itself, how it functions, what its roots are, and give some indication of how it works in the novels of the Bronte sisters. Though, of course, we'll explore that in much more detail once you've got some reading under your belt. As for the Gothic itself as a genre, this dates back to 1765, with the publication of Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto. Walpole actually coined the term Gothic in reference to a genre of fiction, meaning it to refer to something medieval, something old, and that appeal to the old, the pre-modern, is essential to the Gothic novel. The 2 best-known writers of the 18th century Gothic were, of course, Walpole and Anne Radcliffe, whose best-known work is The Mysteries of Udolpho, published in 1794. Both of these novels are considered pretty much definitive in terms of Gothic fiction. They have dark, brooding, villainous characters. They're set in stark, old settings, and there's a sense of lingering or lurking fear hovering beneath their surfaces pretty much all the time. They're very uneasy books to read. As for the specific traits or features of the Gothic novel, or of the Gothic generally, I should probably say a few words about those. Definitions, of course, always being important. As for the properties of the Gothic itself, here's a fairly short list which I think covers most of the major points. One is it tends to be concerned with the supernatural, either the presence of the supernatural, which often does occur, or hints of the supernatural in the narrative. So a sort of a looming or lurking background threat of things unexplainable, or things unexplainable by modern methodologies, always kind of ready to come, if not bursting, perhaps sneaking in through some secret passage door or from the shadows of some crypt. Another typical feature of Gothic fiction is a tendency to set things in old buildings, particularly big old buildings, and buildings with long, medieval, often family-oriented histories. Buildings that embody lineages that go far back beyond the flesh and blood of the characters who are actually enacting the plot of the novel. Buildings with dark halls and secret passages, unexpected nooks, and lots of gloomy art. And even better if lots and lots of bad things have happened in those buildings over the years. A big old building, and particularly a big old stone building, seems to anchor the plot, anchor the setting, the characters to the earth itself. So the boundary between that chthonic, deep, unconscious or subconscious subterranean realm and the realm of daylight, the realm of waking hours, tends to be rather thin in such structures. That is, there's also an appeal here to the depths of the human psyche, to the things that we like to keep hidden, the things that we like to keep in the dark, even from ourselves. The Gothic is permission to explore those things. That's one of the gestures, I think, one of the fictional gestures or narrative gestures that it makes. Anyone who's familiar or a big fan of the horror genre, as I am, will certainly recognize the value of that kind of gesture, and we are looking here at the roots of the horror genre. Another detail worth remembering is that, of course, in the 1760s, in the 18th century generally, we're in the midst of the Enlightenment, we're in the midst of the Age of Reason. So this appeal to the medieval, this appeal to the pre-modern, does seem to be, and in many cases, in many writers' cases rather, explicitly is, not merely a frivolous appeal to something old and nifty, but an appeal to something that predates the modern world and all of the ideological baggage that comes along with modernity. Particularly a challenge to the notion that everything in the world can be known rationally, sort of the guiding doctrine of the Enlightenment. That is, if reason is the one lens or the one eye through which the dominant culture, the dominant intellectual culture says one is supposed to look at the world, Gothicism is one attempt at looking through different lenses or with different eyes. And the instant popularity, for example, as well, of Walpole's book, of the Castle of Otranto, and of Anne Radcliffe's work, is an indication that many in the reading public were dissatisfied with what the Age of Reason was giving them. And they were looking for other ways of experiencing the world themselves, their own consciousness, their own imaginations. That is, the Gothic points to a lack in the mainstream culture of the time. It points to something that many people were hungry for, and that many people in our own society are hungry for as well. And it points as well, maybe not to just a suggestion that the world may not be entirely rationally knowable, but in many cases, I think, a genuine desire for it not to be knowable in that way. And it's probably worth mentioning that as we move through the course, we'll encounter this impulse again in our look at Pre-Raphaelite poetry and Pre-Raphaelite painting, which we'll be doing right before the March break, and in William Morris's wonderful novel House of the Wolfings, which deals explicitly with the Goths. In any case, as I hinted at a few minutes ago, another one of the typical features of Gothic fiction is a dark and brooding villain, someone with dubious motives and a sort of saturnine character, and in many cases a special connection to the structure, the edifice, the building around which much of the narrative revolves. Though, of course, this doesn't always have to be the case. And as I'm sure you've gathered by now, much of the pleasure of the Gothic novel is derived from the fear involved in reading it. These narratives are designed to spark fear in us, to pull fear up out of us. Fear particularly of an other that we don't understand. Something that challenges our stable conception of the world. And that is always an intimidating or frightening experience in some regard. And on the question of challenging our categories, challenging our stability within the narrative structures that we've built around ourselves and that we imagine, I suppose, that we inhabit, I think it's probably time to say a word or two about the sublime. But what do we say about the sublime? The idea of it is important to both Gothicism and Romanticism, so it's obviously something that we need to have on the table. But what exactly is it? The word, I think, tends to be watered down in contemporary usage, often meaning something like just really, really good, which is absolutely not what the word actually means. But if it's going to be really, really anything, probably really, really big is a better way of putting it, although, of course, that's still very wide of the mark. There is an appeal to vastness in the appeal to the sublime, or the invocation of the sublime. A notion that something, the thing described, the thing we're looking at, is big beyond our ability to comprehend its bigness. It's something that, and here I'm appealing to Kant's understanding of what the sublime is, it's something that challenges the ways in which we understand things. Kant uses the example of, I can't recall whether it's a tree or a flower, but a tree or a flower on a mountain. And a tree or a flower can be beautiful, but the mountain can't be said to be beautiful in the way that a tree or a flower is beautiful. Its sheer mass, the way in which it dwarfs us, precludes it from being beautiful. That is the example Kant uses of the sublime. It's big enough that when we perceive it, we can't grasp it all at once and therefore make a judgment about it. For example, about it being beautiful. But even there, I think I'm a little wide of the mark, thinking about how the sublime functions in both Gothic and Romantic literature. So let me press a little harder on that. And just so I can flag something for you, the novel on our reading list that addresses the sublime most completely, I think, is Wuthering Heights. I won't say too much more about that now because that's not what we're reading this week. But you're going to want to have your eyes open for that. Whatever the sublime is. And as I said a moment ago before I distracted myself, the sublime is associated with the emotional state, the psychological state of awe, of awareness bordering on and sometimes crossing over into horror or fear, of our own smallness relative to the vastness and the strength of that with which we are confronted. The sublime doesn't tend to happen in a human context. It tends to be encountered in wild or so-called natural environments. I've mentioned mountains. The ocean is another example, particularly the ocean during a storm, for example. And if you've ever been caught on the water during a sudden thunderstorm, and I have, so I can speak from some experience here, the sense of being surrounded by power that even if you can rationally comprehend how it works, still dwarfs your capacity to appreciate, be it in the strength of the waves or in the raw power of the lightning you can see striking around you. This also is an example of the sublime. These are the forces that conjure myths of the gods of sky and earth and sea. That is, it reminds us, and I think this is really the most useful way of looking at it, at least I find it useful. It reminds us of our limits, of both our physical and our psychological limits, that we are not the masters of that through which we move. We are always subject to forces more powerful than ourselves, and sometimes those forces reveal themselves in landscapes, or in lightning, or in earthquakes, or what have you. That is, the sublime challenges, questions, destabilizes our sense of our own stability within whichever context we happen to find ourselves. But I find I've been going on about this for a while now, and I'm pretty sure y'all get the picture. So I'm going to move on. As we move into the 19th century, the Gothic continues to flourish. Probably the most famous Gothic novel of the 19th century is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published initially in 1818 and then revised and republished in 1831. Much of the writing of Edgar Allan Poe also falls into this category, as, if we want to move a little further toward the end of the century, works such as The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson and Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course. Though this does take us well beyond the 1840s, which is the period we're looking at right now, so it will probably do as a wrap-up for our introduction to the Gothic. Except to say, and this goes back to Frankenstein, that an element of the Gothic that comes up in the 19th century is an encounter with a double of oneself, a double for oneself, as for example the monster is for Victor. This, of course, also is central to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And as we make our way through the Bronte novels, you may find it interesting to keep your eyes open for potential double characters, potential double figures. This is not something that had occurred to me really about these novels before doing the recording for this particular slide, but it's a question that I think I'd like to explore. And perhaps some of you also feel like exploring it with me. So as a final question, I'll just ask, what does any of this have to do with the Brontes? I'm not going to tell you, of course, but I will suggest that you keep your eyes on the landscape, and also be on the lookout for references, direct or indirect, to the supernatural. Pay attention to how buildings are treated. What secrets does a big old stone house hold? How do those secrets threaten the characters? And are there things in these novels that might challenge the reader's concepts of how the world works, the categories through which they think about their experience? The Gothic is intended to challenge these things. It plays with notions of the monstrous, so you'll also want to keep your eyes open for the monstrous in various forms, physical and psychological. And I think I'll want to talk to you a bit more about the monstrous particularly in one of the lectures coming up. For the meantime, though, just do your own exploring. Enjoy the novels. I really, really hope you enjoy the novels. And I do look forward to talking with you about them in our tutorials. For now, though, thank you for listening. I think next time out, I'll probably want to say something about Romanticism, so look for that sometime Wednesday evening. I hope you found this useful, and that your reading is going well. Bye for now.